on a platform like LinkedIn or Twitter, I'm global principal of behavioural science at Ogilvy. I'm fascinated at the intersection of creativity, innovation, and applied behavioural science. How can we learn from birds and apply this to the bullet train? And the key inspiration for addressing the tunnel booms was the kingfisher bird, a bird that's perfectly evolved to dive from the air into water to skewer its prey, a substance that is 800 times denser. If it can go from the air to water, maybe it can go from the land through the tunnel without making such a splash. And by adapting the shape of the kingfisher bill, they were able to address the tunnel boom challenge. If we're making an umbrella and you're used to water-resistant technology, you're not going to think about Revlon nail polish by which to solve a volume and size issue, but we can. And it's bringing these ideas together. The carrots, the farmer's market, were like 3 times the price of the carrots from Sainsbury's up the road. The key difference was the carrots in the farmer's market were still dirty. Right? So it shows, these are still dirty. They must be, like, we can see that they've been pulled out of the soil. How about that? That they must be very precious.
Alternate profession could have been?
Farmer.
What would you do on Mars for fun?
Golf.
Hello, fellows. Welcome to the next episode of Jagged with Just Ravi. Subscribe to my channel for conversations at the edge with thought leaders from the marketing, branding, and the business world. Conversations that ignite new ideas. Ideas with rough and sharp edges. Hi, Sam. So nice to have you on my show.
Yes, Ravi, it's so wonderful to join you. I think I'm certainly rough around the edges this morning if you look at my chin. But wonderful to connect.
Yeah. So it's jagged, rough edges. Yeah. Okay, Sam. If I requested you to tweet your profile, what would you say?
What would I say? I think on a platform like LinkedIn or Twitter, I'm global principal of behavioural science at Ogilvy. So big creative network, and we have a behavioural science practice throughout the organisation. I'm fascinated at the intersection of creativity, innovation, and applied behavioural science. So that's really sort of what I enjoy working on, and really sort of excited to discuss some of the topics today.
Awesome! This is wonderful. Okay, so when I was going through the book, there were so many passages that I was highlighting, and I was like, okay, I'd say this, just to kind of like a punctuation, and then I'm like, no, let Sam say it. Everything you say. Okay, so the dogged pursuit of the revolutionary is an overconfidence we all share. Honestly, Sam, when I'm reading through your book and all the introduction and the context setting that you've done, even Rory's article, it's so humbling. It's so humbling. Like, you are like this one little speck in this world. And, even what appears revolutionary is actually evolutionary. It just appeared because, it came to notice suddenly, or it just built up. So our approach to innovation and creativity, like you said, needs to change. So what are our key innovation myths, and why should we ask? Okay, this question is for later. What are our innovation myths and why they are wrong?
Wonderful questions, and thank you. And you're right. There's this tension between sort of revolutionary thinking, this appetite for radical moonshot ideas, creating things the world has never seen before. And what I'm introducing and hopefully bringing to light even further, alongside other authors like Matt Ridley, who speaks a lot about the evolution of innovation, is that actually a lot of what we see today are adaptations on what exists. So my book, Evolutionary Ideas, first exposes some of these myths of innovation. As you say, we have this attraction to the radical, and there's a few reasons behind this. One is that we assume that positions of leadership and authority need to come up with big, game-changing, novel ideas. There's a bit of ego that's based with that, and what might be considered small tweaks or adaptations seem below our level of status. There's a natural optimism that many of us all share, and an optimism bias is a part of our psychology that's been referenced in many different circumstances, from insurance to healthcare. We all assume that we will be the odd one out. If you just look at Vegas, a city that's been built on the spoils of gambling, people still roll up every day and think that I will be the one that wins. This time it will be different, right? So there's a natural optimism when it comes to innovation that will break through. But the last point, I think, is the most important when we look at the innovation myths. And that is, we have a natural sense of proportionality with how we navigate the world. Mm-hmm. If you imagine hearing a loud bang, we sort of assume that this loud bang required a large input by which to make it. We drop a plate and it smashes. You boil a pot of water. There's a natural assumption that we've needed to create enough energy, the equivalent energy elsewhere, to boil that water. And in the physical domain, it largely stands true. Big outputs often do require big inputs. Mm-hmm. But in the realm of psychology and creativity and innovation, actually we find, firstly, that we can have large outcomes and large effects with small inputs. And that's something that's been well documented in behavioral science, with butterfly effects and small tweaks to a checkout page leading to millions of pounds and dollars worth of increased revenue. So that's one innovation myth, that sort of big problems require big ideas. And actually, we can see a lot that some big problems can be solved by some subtle small tweaks. But what I think I'm most excited, and what I think is most novel about evolutionary ideas is focusing on a second element of proportionality. And that is that novel problems require novel solutions. So we assume that if it's a problem that we've never seen before or come across in our industry or workplace, that we need to generate an equally innovative, unknown response to it. But actually, chances are this problem has been solved before. You don't require a novel solution. You just need to find the existing solution and bring it to your problem. And that's the second innovation myth, that novel problems require novel solutions. And hopefully my book helps to see the other way there.
Awesome. I mean, just putting that in perspective is such a huge thing, because, like they say, steal like an artist,
That's right.
Adapt it. It's, yeah.
And there are many industries where, and sometimes in the creative field, we shy away from adaptation. But if we look at artists, musicians, sort of the appropriation of material is important in the creative process. But I think where we go in this text is that there are many examples of ideas that we can still execute differently. I mean, there's just as there's sort of 6 strings to a violin, yet multiple different orchestrations of music, we can have sort of set principles by which we can explore and find ideas that exist in the world and still execute them with brilliance and creativity. I mean, this is the area, as I said in the beginning, I work in Ogilvy, and we pride ourselves on our creative. I mean, it is our business. We are a creative business, and even within that, I'm a firm believer that we can take ourselves a lot of the way to creating creative and effective and scalable solutions by starting with what exists rather than a blank sheet of paper.
Awesome. Get ourselves out of the way, our ego. Yes. So how have we solved this before? Like Sam says, ask this question first, rather than how are we going to solve this. And like you said, some strings of a violin, some colors in the world, some alphabets, some numbers, and, look at our progress. But this acknowledgement is important that, like we are just one part of the evolution, and evolution is nature's problem solver. And when you affirm this with biology and technology. I mean, it becomes such a powerful argument. And after that, if you're not using this, it's like, I mean, when are we going to get it? This is so powerful. So, biomimicry. Uh, we're going to talk about biomimicry and
Yes,
Triz, and you can
wonderful.
take any of the examples, because that really is like a hammer on the argument, again and again, that look
Great.
around, just look around.
I'm really pleased that it landed there. And what I've tried to explore is to help us identify that an evolutionary approach is really valuable when it comes to innovation and ideas in the cognitive realm. I wanted to explore some existing methodologies and industries that already apply this thinking slightly differently. And you mentioned, Jesravi, that biomimicry is an industry that I reference in the book. And for me, stumbling across the field of biomimicry was actually the trigger for writing the book. As soon as I sort of learned about biomimicry, I sort of felt this is fundamentally what we do with psychology that biomimic architects and designers are doing with the design and technology. So the field of biomimicry really assumes that anything around us that has survived in nature today has undergone 3.8 billion years of research and development. So there's got to be something valuable with the animals, the flora and fauna that surrounds us today. So rather than again look to the sky or assume a magic bolt, sort of lightning bolt, will come out of our pencil when solving a design or architectural solution, let's first look to nature. And one of the first examples of this, and I reference this in the book, is the development of the Shinkansen 500 speed train, bullet train, that connects Tokyo and Osaka. And many of your listeners will be familiar with maybe the bullet train, but might be less familiar with the process that was undergone in designing it. And the challenge that was faced on the Shinkansen was reducing the speed, or the time that it took to travel between Tokyo and Osaka. And while there are many sort of facets of the train that needed to be explored, one of the fundamental issues actually wasn't speed. They didn't need to increase the speed of the trains. They had experimental carriages that could sort of travel fast enough. And what the issue was sound. And that actually the faster the trains went, the more sound they made. And one of the key problems they faced was actually through tunnels. So the Shinkansen line has a series of tunnels across it, as many train lines do. We might sort of identify this as an environmental constraint if we think of it in evolutionary theory. And as the trains sort of bulleted through, they created these tunnel booms, these loud shotgun sounds that was louder than the regulation in Japan. So rather than, again, look at sort of hardcore physics and see how they might explore this, the team actually looked to birds. How can we learn from birds and apply this to the bullet train? And the key inspiration for addressing the tunnel booms was the kingfisher bird, a bird that's perfectly evolved to dive from the air into water to skewer its prey, a substance that is 800 times denser. If it can go from the air to water, maybe it can go from the land through the tunnel without making such a splash. And by adapting the shape of the kingfisher bill, they were able to address the tunnel boom challenge. And this is just a wonderful example of borrowing from nature to solve what is a distinctively human problem. And the field of biomimicry continues to evolve and adapt and apply this thinking, whether that's learning from the ears of hares to develop air cooling systems, learning from the proboscis of mosquitoes to develop painless needles. There's a wonderful business in North America that has adapted from the shape of a humpback whale to create more efficient wind turbines. So it's, again, don't start from scratch. Let's borrow from nature, because if it's around today, there's got to be something good about it. So there are evolutionary principles in biomimicry. And that was sort of the first building block, I think, of evolutionary ideas, that we can steal from nature and apply it in distinctively human problems. And the second industry that you referenced just before is the methodology of Triz. And if I'm not rabbiting on too long, I'll just quickly sort of talk a little bit about Triz. And Triz is a framework that was developed by a Russian engineer, and he was a young engineer that was sort of picked up and put in the Russian Naval Patent Office. And one of the reasons I began to explore Triz, firstly, was that this gentleman, his name was Genrikh Altshuler, found in the Russian Patent Office that actually a lot of the patents that he was viewing were actually similar solutions to existing problems. It found like actually where we could continue to reinvent the same idea just in different parts of the Navy. He later went to assess 200,000 patents. And found and working with the team looked at the level of inventiveness of these patents and found that actually 95% of these patents are actually existing solutions. So when you think again, when we go back to that challenge of our innovation myth of sort of optimism and ego and proportionality, actually a vast number of these solutions, even if they're receiving patents, have already been solved before, right? But through this analysis, Altshuler and the team created patterns of technical solutions. They call these inventive principles. So just as we might look at a species in biology and classify them based on the presence of gills or a spinal cord, in Triz, which is a Russian acronym for the theory of inventive problem solving, they classify them based on their technical features. So, for example, inventive principle number 7, and there are 40 of them in the Triz methodology, is the concept of nested doll. So if you imagine a classic Russian nested doll where you have sort of babushka dolls housed inside each other, we can see other examples, we can see other examples of nested doll solutions in the world around us, whether that's a telescopic lens for a camera, whether that's a nail polish that has the brush inside the bottle, whether it's a retractable tape measure, whether it's a Kinder Surprise. They're all examples of nested dolls. So we can classify those as engineering solutions under nested doll number 7. So the team found these patterns of evolved solutions. Engineers and designers converged fundamentally on the same idea, just executed slightly differently, whether it's a tape measure, a camera lens, or a nail polish. And that's kind of the first interesting thing about Triz, that actually we can find these patterns of solutions that we've naturally converged upon in industry. Just like a dolphin and a shark in biology have converged on the dorsal fin, right? They both have a dorsal fin, even though the shark is a fish and the dolphin is a mammal. Over time, and based on the constraints of water, they've converged on the same winning solution. We do this too, and Triz helps to identify that. There's a fascinating space.
It's mind blowing. Actually, it's mind blowing. The more let it sink in, the more. Okay, so it's like a contradictory emotion. If one is like, oh my God, it's already been done, I have to just figure it out. And the other is how powerful nature is, how powerful the work people have done and built on it. And you can build on it too and take it further, evolution itself is doing. Like you said, 40 principles. Just knowing that there are 40 inventive principles, and there would be, just using 2 or 3, I can make something more useful, more convenient, more faster for the times. It's like amazing. But somebody framed the problem in such a way and asked the question correctly that, all I need to do is find out how to, go through air and not do this. So who's doing this? Let me look around. That mindset is going to invite solutions workable in nature. It's so powerful, the biomimicry and Triz. And, the wonderful thing is, Sam, that when you think of it, the psychological contradictions that you talk about, and the evolutionary nature of human being, how we have evolved makes so much sense.
That's right. And if we think of biomimicry, I think the key lesson from biomimicry is that we can adapt from, we can borrow these or steal these evolved solutions from nature. If we look at Triz, we can see actually rather than millions of years of biological evolution, through the work of thousands of engineers and designers, we also converge on winning solutions. We can see patterns of winning solutions. And you mentioned just now that the concept of contradiction. And that's a really important one, as you say, and it's about asking the right question or helping us to define the challenge that we're faced with. So to explore the language of contradictions, and this was a sort of a term that Altshuler, the author of the Triz methodology, sort of developed. Innovation is about overcoming a contradiction. So that might be, how can we make a bulletproof jacket strong enough to stop a bullet, but light enough for people to wear, right? That's a contradiction that we need to resolve through innovation. How can we make an umbrella that's big enough to cover the human body, but small enough to fit in a handbag, right? That's a sort of a contradiction that innovation needs to solve. And the Triz methodology takes us one step further there, and I don't want to overcomplicate this, because it's required a book to help to sort of step through these fields. But I think it's important that Triz has developed a contradiction matrix. So if we think of variables like weight or speed or time, cost or durability, concepts that can be sort of more easily measured, we can see actually how can we increase the volume of something without increasing its size, right? That might be a sort of an element of the matrix. The team have 39 different parameters that they explore. But if we look at the matrix and we say, how do we increase volume without increasing size? Then you look at the grid and we say, well, let's start with principle number 7, nested doll. Right? That's a great example of how we can increase the volume without increasing the size. Let's start there. And when we start there, rather than just thinking nested doll, we have this world of inspiration with our telescopic lens, our retractable tape measure, our nail polish that can help us to inspire a winning solution ourselves. So in evolutionary ideas, we also embrace this language of contradiction, but rather than a contradiction of size or weight or volume or speed, we look at psychological contradictions, as you say, that there's a world of psychological inventive principles that we can draw upon. So, for example, in the book, I explore 5 psychological contradictions. How do we increase trust without changing the truth? Just like how do we increase the strength of a Kevlar jacket without increasing its weight in the physical realm, we can start to explore it in the cognitive realm. How do we aid decisions without limiting choice? I mean, that feels like a contradiction that innovation needs to solve. How do we trigger action without forcing a response? How do we increase loyalty without enhancing incentives? Sometimes we think we must pull this rational lever to enhance loyalty, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. How do we improve experiences without changing their duration? So we explore 5 psychological contradictions in the book, and we see actually what are the evolved solutions that can help us to resolve these contradictions.
That's so powerful, and we'll delve deeper into a few of them. So Sam, like in advertising, I've been in brand and market research and branding. I still am. We used to call it paradox. It's like we advertising people have understood things at the surface and have been using it. But now it's time to just kind of own it deeply to really, really understand the human tendencies. And this contradiction and the language, like you've talked about, is such a powerful thing, because if you can name it, you can start asking the right questions, and then you're directed in the right direction, like you said. But this contradiction, it's the two opposite forces. I mean, I'm looking at it, I'm zooming out a little bit, because it was coming to me that how powerful is water and fire coming together? The hot water is because these are the opposite elements that perhaps, like they say, shape the world. I mean, it's believed Yeah. How powerful is masculine and feminine forces coming together, for creativity? Day in, day out, we figure out problems to communicate. How do we communicate this? But if you can just step back and say, what are the contradictions that
Yeah.
we are going to aid resolve for the consumer? I mean, it's so powerful to even have that in mind. So because all the examples, the entire framework is so powerful, all the marketing branding examples that you have used, if one reflects on it, like, oh my god. So in the trust deficit times of today, Sam, especially after COVID, like they say, in the COVID times, we just trusted our own eyes. We had stopped trusting our relatives. We had
Yes.
stopped trusting everyone. Just stay away and let me survive this. So we'll take that first principle, reinforcing trust without altering the truth.
You've covered a lot of ground just there really quickly, but I think you've now, like, a lot of what we discuss is what feels intuitively right, and I think that's an important thing for us to recognize in the field of behavioral science. Now, sometimes when it's introduced to people, it feels like this magical new thing, and it's not. It's the codification of what we likely already know works. If you think of sort of "given ye shall receive," it's a sort of a simple analysis of reciprocity, right? A lot of behavioral science has been passed down in folklore and kitchen wisdom, and what behavioral science is doing is helping us to name it and codify it, and therefore apply it. And just to discuss sort of quickly about the nature of contradictions and what you're saying, I think contradictions can be helpful for us to distill down what is the problem that we're looking to solve. And as I said, in the book, I explore 5 that are very common, high order sort of challenges: trust, decision making, action, loyalty, experience. We can get more and more specific there, but when we go back to our innovation myth of novel problems need novel solutions, chances are your problem is one about decision making or loyalty or action, and so let's start there. But when you mentioned the convergence of fire and water and music, what I think contradictions, for me, that's not the role of the contradiction. Actually, what the next step that we'll discuss now, I think, really helps that. Actually, when we look at bringing foreign ideas into your industry, so adapting from novel music or bringing feminine and masculine attributes together to create something new. It's about casting a new light on an existing problem. And that's where, to go to Triz for a moment before we explore the sort of a newer space in psychology, that's where actually a kinder surprise and a retractable tape measure and a telescopic lens, they're all very different industries and executions, but we can be like, how do we think more like a kinder surprise by which to solve this? And that's when I think we get that convergence of ideas. How can we think more like a nail polish to solve this? Because chances are we wouldn't be thinking that way. If we're making an umbrella and you're used to water resistant technology, you're not going to think about Revlon nail polish by which to solve a volume and size issue, but we can. And it's bringing these ideas together, and that is, for me, the key to creativity. And so let's now delve a little bit more in trust, one of the 5 psychological contradictions. And in trust, we explore 3 different psychological inventive principles. Just as we have nested doll and Triz, behavioral science gives us this code to understand these patterns of human innovation over time. And in trust, we explore signaling, we explore social proof that many of our listeners will be aware of, we explore a concept of operational transparency. So those are the 3 psychological principles that we explore. And if we're to look a little bit about operational transparency, say, you mentioned that it's very hard for us to trust things based on what someone might just tell us, what someone might claim. And all of these are whether it's signaling, social proof, they all help to give us evidence to the truthfulness of a statement or an outcome. In operational transparency, it's really about seeing the working. It's about looking at the process that's involved in achieving an outcome so you can believe it. There's a natural tendency in organizations today to distance customers from the inner workings. We think it's ugly. We think people don't need to see this. So we try and sort of minimize access to what we're actually doing and speed up the nature of our response, whether that's an ATM that just passes out our money, whether it's Google that gives us our answer in 0.02 of a second. We don't see the working of Google. We can't tap into the algorithm. It just gives us it as fast as we can. And what Professor Ryan Boyle and Michael Norton from Harvard have sort of explored in their research is that sometimes we find by showing the working, by being transparent in what's happening, we can not only increase the perceived value of a service, but we can increase trust. So in their study, they explore kayak.com. So if we think about Google that spits out an answer in 0.02 of a second, whether it's sort of travel advice through to what is the weather today, actually they found that by slowing this process down and showing how the algorithm is working, saying we're now searching flights on the eastern seaboard, we're now looking at this in economy rates, so just helping us to see what the algorithm is doing to work for you, and we trust it more. And this transparency can work in something like an ATM, where it looks at you sort of counting all the money before it spits it out. Just so it's like, okay, well, I trust that it's got the right money because I've sort of seen it thinking rather than just spitting it out. All the way through to what I think are sort of more novel but more intuitive transparent solutions. And that could be having a little bit of the production process on a product that we might buy. I mean, we bought some tomatoes the other day, and I thought the more expensive ones tend to still have the vine attached. And it's like, oh, okay, like it's really close to like you've still got the vine on it, and rationally that might be considered a hassle, right? Just like when I used to live in the UK, in Queen's Park, we used to go to our farmers market, and the carrots at the farmers market were like 3 times the price of the carrots from Sainsbury's up the road. The key difference was the carrots in the farmers market were still dirty, right? So it shows, oh, these are still dirty. They must be, like, we can see that they've been pulled out of the soil. How about that? That they must be very precious. So by having a bit of a signal of the process that's gone behind it, we can again increase perceived value and trust in its freshness or its quality. And brands are adapting this. And again, not necessarily adapting it because they have a team of behavioral scientists working with them, just because it's an intuitively good solution, and we can do it again and again. Monteith's, the brand of apple cider in New Zealand, wanted to increase perceptions of trust of their claim of freshly crushed apples and pears. So to help to do this, just like the tomatoes that are still on the vine when you pick them up from your local Sainsbury's or Tesco's, they put a twig from the orchard in every box of cider, just to have a little sort of cue of the production process, be a bit more transparent in how they actually create their cider by putting a twig in the box. So we can be really creative with how we provide this transparency, whether it's an algorithm on a website through to simply stacking the raw ingredients of your pasta at the front window of a restaurant so people know that you make your pasta fresh on site. There's lovely different ways in which we can see this working in practice.
Yeah, awesome. And like, trust is such a profound big thing, Sam. Like, you have to earn my trust. But just the fact that you can break it down into aspects and take little steps to build it, to initiate it. I mean, isn't that wonderful? I'll stick to branding and marketing, yes,
of course,
but I'm saying in relationships too, in everything. If you start figuring out, what can help, definitely.
But you're right. But if we think, so I mentioned one of the principles is signaling, right? That we explore in trust, and a key element of signaling is the cost of the signal to to deliver. So if something costs us, then it's a more trustworthy signal. If we can see that all the way back into biology signaling. If we look at the peacock and its flamboyant tail, or springboks that stot, they just jump around, and it shows the lions that they're probably too fit to catch, so don't even try. But that costs a lot of energy. It costs a lot of energy. If it didn't cost energy, then the lions would be like, it's just telling them I'm fit. But we see that in relationships. We see costly signals with engagement rings, right? That is an expensive diamond is a signal of the trustworthiness of the sort of a longer term relationship. I wouldn't spend so much money on an expensive stone if I didn't have the intention of being with you for some time. So it can work. And what as you say, we can start to look at building something like trust or reinforcing trustworthiness in a more systematic way. And we can think about, well, how might we signal this? What element of our product or service will stand out? What is the cost that we can illustrate that shows that we're there for the long term? We see this, and I share many examples in the book. When we look at social proof, again, there's lots of ways in which we can build trustworthiness, whether that's testimonials or a star rating of an Amazon checkout page. We see this all around us. And transparency, as I've mentioned. But we can start to then chip away in a more systematic approach, just like we learned with Triz, that it can be. We've not gone as far as to create a matrix in the book of psychological contradictions, but we could explore that.
Yeah, absolutely. So wonderful. So, like you started with, where in other categories, in other frames of reference, this has been done, how differently, and can we borrow from it? So that's the new element, and that's the contradiction support. Also, as you were talking about certain aspects of certain psychological principles, there are some that will work more in certain cultures. Like in India, the social proof will work a lot. You'd see crowds, in bazaars, and okay, this runs. This so many people can't lie, or so many people can't be fooled. Then this whole thing of food stalls. Because you can see what he's doing. So it's not unhealthy or unhygienic, because I can see what he's doing.
I can see them working. In Starbucks, they lowered the height of the coffee machine so customers could see the baristas making the coffee. You raise an important point in cultural differences and differences in context and personality, and that's something that I acknowledge in the book. Certainly, this is we're looking at trying to start with universalities, and what's most important is it's not unknowing that actually context and culture and individual differences certainly exist and play a large role in behaviour change. But my argument is absolutely. But let's start with a universal space and test and learn, and let's not transport an execution of an idea. Let's transport the prospect of social proof. We can't say, well, this social proof execution worked in Sydney, it's going to work in Mumbai. Maybe not, but social proof as an idea could be valuable. How do we execute it in a culturally specific way? Dilip Soman, who wrote The Last Mile and has recently published Behavioural Science in the Wild from Rotman. We had a really helpful conversation during the writing of this book, and he likened the transportation of nudges or behavioural science a bit like thinking about the mass production of something like a fridge. Okay? So let's say we were to centralize the production of fridges. Let's say, okay, we're in Sydney. We're going to produce 1,000 fridges, and we're going to ship them off to 4 corners of the world. And that makes sense from one perspective, that there's economies of scale. We have one factory, and then we just ship them. But what happens when they land in Mumbai is that they don't fit the socket. So we've wasted all this time, and they just don't work. So rather than shipping the fridge, let's ship the raw ingredients so it can be made fit for purpose in the market by which it lives, and we can see if it works or not. And that is the approach that I'm taking here, that it's not about transporting the final execution, but the raw ingredients that can create something rich in context and in culture. So I think really important there, because it might sort of seem an oversight, but it's an important acknowledgement there.
Yeah. No, that comes in the book a lot, and one of the key is context is king. So thank you for elaborating on that. So I love this whole thing because I'm a big believer of archetypes and symbols. So like you said, begin from the universal essence of the principle, and then you're applying it to a category context, a culture, a personality, a segment, like you so nicely said, the Triz. The first principle is actually segmenting, right?
Yes.
And of course, towards the end, you've covered it in a whole chapter how to apply these tools. But I'm just excited about getting this new bag of tools.
And similarly, coming from a brand background as well, I mean, archetypes can sometimes be controversial. Sort of classic Jungian archetypes of the lover, the explorer, the magician, the hero, the everyday guy. And I have always found them immensely helpful, just because it helps you to find a different frame of reference to think about your promise. so it just helps you to think, well, what if we were to actually deliver this as the hero versus the lover or the innocent? It just, again, it becomes creative fuel. And we can see patterns of archetypes that live, whether it's from Star Wars to Lost through to whatever. But once you know the framework, you can't help but see these patterns, whether it's the judges on the X Factor, it doesn't matter. We just see it. And I think the same thing can be true of here. It helps us to find patterns of existing solutions and borrow from those to create something new.
Yeah. Okay. Improving experiences without. Would you like to choose any contradiction that you like to talk about, that you find that marketers find most counterintuitive and just don't want to admit, or we could go with experiences aspect, whichever?
I think I'll touch on, because I think aiding decision making without limiting choice is a contradiction that sometimes feels a bit odd. I mean, because we're sort of intuitively we think more is more, and the more choices we give people, the easier it'll be to make a choice and be satisfied. But the research tells us the opposite: that the more choices we have, the more likely we are to regret, defer, delay a decision. So I think a contradiction to be explored is about sort of aiding decision making without limiting choice. And there are several different principles that we explore in the book there, from defaults all the way through to chunking up information to aid decision making. But I might not go into. I think that's a really that can be a counterintuitive space for people to become familiar with. But one area that I got sort of deeper in than I would expect in researching the book was around experience. And how do we aid sort of improve experiences without changing their duration? And the thing that I found most fascinating in exploring this part of the book was around the flexible perception of time. We have a difference between clock time and brain time. That while sort of clock time is consistent, brain time, the perception of time, is anything but. And we see that through the animal kingdom. We see that people often sort of wonder, how can I never swat this fly? It's because actually they see the world faster than we do, right? It makes sense for actually a clock time second for a fly is much longer than a clock time second for us. And that's an odd concept to get our head around. But if you think a fly needs to respond, or a hawk needs to respond very quickly, whereas whale, if a whale had the perception of time like a fly, I mean, it can't move its body fast enough to respond to anything. So it doesn't make sense for it to perceive time as fast as a fly. So a whale will have a different brain time perception of time than a fly. And researchers have found this by exploring flickering of lights and really sort of fascinating studies of the perception of flickers within a specific time to illustrate actually what's able to be processed by animals. Anyway, I deviate a little bit there, but it's fascinating, I think, insofar as it starts in the animal kingdom. But when we look at ourselves, brain time is also a bit like an accordion. We can stretch it and contract it. And the things that tend to stretch it are things that like sort of novelty, stress, high emotionality, fear. If we imagine when we put the anecdote, the sort of time slows down when you're sort of facing an accident, that's kind of research suggests that could be true. Because our attentional resources are all focused on this period of time. Whereas when we're in a safe and familiar environment, when we're doing a familiar activity like taking the bins out or on your daily commute, time can sort of just disappear. So where did it all go? And I think that's a really interesting concept to wrap our head around, that brain time and clock time are fundamentally different. And while we can often maximize for clock time, we need to consider brain time. And this is where working in Ogilvy in our specific practice, I've been sort of fortunate to work with Rory Sutherland, who, as you mentioned, wrote the foreword of the book. It is a huge inspiration of mine and the book itself. And Rory sort of talks a lot about, and one of his sort of early TED Talks explores the sort of perception of time on the Eurostar. Where there were sort of engineers were brought in to reduce the time that it took to travel between London and Paris. And if you were to think of like sort of biomimicry, let's whack a kingfisher bill on the nose to help speed it up. But that's not the solution. rather than sort of speeding the train up, sort of Rory argued, what if we had champagne serving sort of lightly clad supermodels walking up and down the train handing out free champagne? People would ask for the train to be slowed down. It's a great example of actually, let's not think about the time itself, let's think about enjoyment, and that sort of opens up again a fresh space for us thinking about experiences. And I explore in the book one concept that some of your listeners might be familiar with, is the concept of the peak end effect in really informing brain time and our memory of an experience. And we tend to remember things based on the peak of the experience and how they end. And this has been replicated in many industries, from looking at sort of ice baths that participants have their hands in cold baths, all the way through to receiving feedback as students. It looks like it is best to sort of end with the positives rather than end with the negatives. But we can see this in experiences in creating sort of really unique peaks, like these high points of an experience, rather than thinking let's improve the average outcome of a hotel stay from a 6 to a 7.5. And we can do this by increasing the thread count of the linen and the softness of the pillows, with all these little micro factors to improve it. Actually, it can be more effective for our experience to introduce some 10s in the mix. I write in the book, Chip and Dan Heath found a lovely example in Los Angeles. It's called the Magic Castle Hotel. It's sort of, I think, in the top 10 on TripAdvisor in Los Angeles, up against some sort of stiff competition when it's actually a bit of a clapped out hotel without a lift. But what they do by the pool is they have what's known as a popsicle hotline. So it's a red phone box that people by the pool pick up, and actually a waiter comes down with gloves on and hands out a free ice popsicle. And it's just an element of novelty and a special experience that takes them to a 10, right? So thinking about scattering some 10s rather than lifting the average to improve the peaks of an experience. And finally, how it ends, that's the peak end effect. So it's always important to consider how we leave an interview, how we leave an experience in a restaurant. It could be mint choc chips with your bill. For Amazon, I write when sort of the website crashed, they have their sort of lovely fuzzy dogs from Amazon that delay the error message. It just leaves a bit more of a sweeter taste in your mouth as you experience something that might otherwise be a little bit bitter. So sort of that was an exceptionally long monologue. But I think when we talk about experience, I think the first thing is this: brain time and clock time aren't the same. We need to sort of start to think about what influences brain time, and that's novelty, stress, enjoyment when we look at peaks, rather than just the maximum sort of lifting the average or looking at the duration itself. And that's an area that sort of blew my mind researching. I think is something that we can bring into service design and into our daily lives.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think that sort of understanding where these pain points might be, that could be points of boredom. Actually, when we think about boredom, we often think, well, it's just downtime. But actually, when we're bored, we're really stressed. Because our body is thinking, as we go back to sort of why boredom is an adaptive trait, because it tells our body that there's richer social, cognitive, emotional stimulus elsewhere than what we're doing now. You're not going to find your mate or the love of your life and sort of sitting on a bench waiting for your luggage. So when we're bored, we're stressed, and when we're stressed, time slows down. So it's like a double whammy. And if we start to sort of think, okay, so if we're bored, we're stressed. If we're stressed, time slows down. How can we help people not be bored in these key times? What are some of the levers again we can pull to take out these blemishes in our experience? And they're all around us. Yeah. People have solved this problem. You're not unique in this in that. How can you bring that to your business, your industry, your context? Oh, it's a stick up.
We went literal in rapid fire in execution.
Right.
Signature rapid fire. Mother's best advice.
Oof, put it in a box.
Alternate profession could have been.
Farmer.
What would you do on Mars for fun?
Golf.
Okay. As for your wife, your most often used phrase.
Sorry.
One thing no one knows about you.
One thing no one knows about me. I think I'm a little bit dyslexic, which makes it tough writing a book. When I submitted one of the early copies, I had a typo in the book's title.
Wow, and that makes you very creative too. Okay, what would you tell your 18-year-old self?
Enjoy every day.
What's your favorite childhood memory?
I think riding a pony up in the country we used to go.
Okay. What's your greatest joy?
My family and kids.
Okay. What's a lesson that took you a long time to learn?
I think there's this getting a bit deep, but I think this drive for success and achievement and the simple things in life. I think that's taken me a while to. I've still not learned it completely, but being kind to yourself and balancing things out, I think is a life lesson.
Awesome. Okay, what's next?
Who knows? Let's see. Time will tell.
Okay, you've learned that lesson then.
yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
That's fun. Thank you.
Okay, so Sam, I'd request you to share your online addresses about the book if you want to say anything. How can people reach out to you? Although everything will be there in the show notes, but yes.
Please, no, thank you. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I think it's at @S_Tatam, TATAM for Mike, or LinkedIn. Please, they're good channels, and I mean, very kind for having me on to talk about. I should put it in my bio at the beginning that I've written a book called Evolutionary Ideas. It's been a big passion for lots of years, and I'm really thrilled that it's out there, and hopefully it's inspiring people to think differently and arming us to include behavioural science and the creative opportunities that this field provides in their approach to innovation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for writing that book.
I the mantra of your podcast. It's about what happens at the edge. And as you say, it can be rough, it can be sharp, it can be imperfect. But I think I'm a big believer of, creativity lies at the edges. It's a belief that we have at Ogilvy. It's certainly sort of at the intersection of things that otherwise shouldn't meet. So I think discussions on the edge is exactly as it should be.